There comes a time in every man's life when he realizes the house has grown too quiet, and the empty chair at the dinner table speaks louder than any conversation ever did. Eli Stoltzfus knows this silence well. 3 years since his Martha passed. 3 years of meals for one, and prayers whispered to walls that remember her laughter. At 63, the Amish widower goes through the motions of living. His farm runs itself, his neighbors check on him with gentle persistence, and every Tuesday he drives his buggy to the county horse auction, not because he needs another horse, but because it fills another empty hour. But this Tuesday is different. Among the crowd, he spots a small girl with tired eyes, watching the animals alone. Her clothes are too thin for the October chill, her face too serious for her young years. What happens when a man's heart calls him to break the rules that have shaped his entire life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window of Eli's farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table where Martha's wedding quilt lay folded in its cedar chest nearby. He'd moved the chest from their bedroom 6 months ago, unable to bear the sight of it each morning, yet unwilling to store it away completely. The quilt represented 37 years of marriage, every stitch a memory, every pattern a shared moment that now belonged only to him. Eli poured his coffee into the same blue ceramic mug Martha had given him on their first Christmas together. The ritual never changed. Black coffee, 2 pieces of toast with jam she'd canned the summer before she died, and the newspaper spread across the table to fill the space where conversation once lived. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore, just present, like morning fog that settles over the valley and stays until the sun burns it away. His farm stretched across 40 acres of Pennsylvania's Lancaster County, where rolling hills met clouded skies, and tradition ran deeper than the roots of century-old oak trees. The Stoltzfus family had worked this land for 4 generations, and Eli had assumed he and Martha would pass it on to children who never came. They'd never spoken much about the absence. It was God's will, Martha would say, her hand finding. His during evening prayers. Some gifts arrive in different packages than we expect. The knock on his door came at 7:30, as predictable as sunrise. Jacob Yoder, his closest neighbor and lifelong friend, stood on the porch with his usual morning greeting and a thermos of Ruth's coffee. "Morning, Eli. Ruth thought you might need some real coffee today." Jacob's weathered face creased into a familiar smile. At 68, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd spent decades working the earth, his hands permanently stained with soil and purpose. "Tell Ruth her coffee's strong enough to wake the dead," Eli replied, accepting the thermos, with genuine gratitude, though I'm not sure that's entirely a blessing. They walked toward the barn together, their conversation following well-worn paths. Jacob's wife, Ruth, had been Martha's dearest friend, and since the funeral, she'd appointed herself as Eli's unofficial guardian, ensuring he ate properly and didn't retreat too far into solitude. It was a kindness he appreciated, even when he craved the emptiness. "Bishop Samuel mentioned you've been spending Tuesday mornings at the horse auction," Jacob said. Not quite a question, but not entirely casual either. In their community, patterns were noticed, changes discussed with the gentle concern of people who'd known each other since childhood. "A man needs purpose," Eli answered, latching the barn door after checking on his 2 workhorses. "Martha always said idle hands invite trouble." Martha also said a lot of things about the wisdom of community. Jacob's tone carried the weight of unspoken concern. "Ruth wonders if you might join us for dinner Sunday. The Millers will be there, and young Thomas is thinking about buying the Henderson place." The Henderson place. Eli knew it well. A small farm bordering his property, empty for 2 years since old Walt died. The idea of new neighbors should have brought comfort, but lately everything felt like change he wasn't ready to navigate. "I'll consider it," Eli said, though they both knew he likely wouldn't come. Social gatherings had become difficult since Martha's death, filled with well-meaning questions about his future and gentle suggestions about remarriage that made his chest tighten with something between grief and panic. The rest of the morning passed in familiar routines. Eli tended his animals, repaired a section of fence damaged by last week's storm, and spent an hour in his workshop crafting wooden toys for the annual church auction. His hands moved automatically through motions learned over decades, creating small horses and farm animals that children would treasure and parents would display with pride. But as Tuesday approached, he found himself thinking about the girl at the horse auction. She appeared every week now, always alone, always watching the animals with the patience of someone far older than her years. Last Tuesday, she'd worn the same thin jacket despite the October chill, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days. Something about her reminded him of Rebecca, his brother David's daughter, who'd visited the farm during summers before David left the community 20 years ago. Rebecca had possessed that same serious expression, the look of a child who'd learned to observe the world carefully before trusting it. David. The thought of his brother still brought a complex mix of grief and frustration. They'd been close. Once before, David questioned everything their father had taught them, before the arguments that split their family and sent David into the English world beyond their community's borders. Eli had chosen tradition, stability, the comfort of beliefs, passed down through generations. David had chosen questions, uncertainty, and a world where faith competed with doubt on equal terms. The Amish community of Millbrook Valley numbered just over 200 souls, spread across family farms that had sustained them for more than a century. Bishop Samuel Byler led them with the stern compassion of a man who understood that preserving their way of life required constant vigilance against the temptations of the outside world. The English, their term for anyone outside their faith, lived differently, embraced change, valued individual choice over community stability. Eli had never questioned this separation. It provided structure, purpose, a clear understanding of right and wrong that didn't bend with changing fashions or contemporary philosophies. Martha had thrived within these boundaries, finding joy in quilting circles, church suppers, and the seasonal rhythms that marked their years together. But now, sitting in his kitchen on Monday evening, preparing for another Tuesday at the horse auction, Eli felt something shifting inside him. The girl's presence had become a constant thought, a puzzle that refused to resolve itself into the neat categories that usually organized his world. He opened Martha's cedar chest and touched the wedding quilt's edge. The fabric felt soft beneath. His fingers, each patch chosen with care, each pattern representing a different season of their marriage. Martha had begun it during their first year together and added sections over the decades, creating a visual history of their love that would outlast them both. "What would you do, Martha?" he whispered to the empty room. "What would you say about a child who watches horses like she's memorizing something precious?" The silence that answered him felt different than usual, not empty but expectant, as if the house itself was waiting for something to change. Outside, the October wind moved through barren fields, carrying the promise of winter and the certainty that seasons, like everything else, must eventually turn toward something new. Tuesday. Morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made the world look newly washed. Eli hitched his mare, Daisy, to the buggy earlier than usual, driven by a restlessness he couldn't name. The drive to the county fairgrounds took 30 minutes through back roads lined with maple trees, showing their October colors, and he used the time to pray for patience with his own growing curiosity. The horse auction drew the same crowd each week. Farmers looking for work animals, dealers hoping for bargains, and hobbyists attracted by the spectacle of commerce and tradition intersecting. In a modern world, Eli parked his buggy in the designated area, nodding to familiar faces as he made his way toward the auction ring. She was there again, standing near the fence that separated spectators from the animals. Today, her clothes looked even thinner against the morning chill. Jeans with worn knees, sneakers that had seen better seasons, and that same jacket that seemed inadequate for anything colder than summer evening. But her eyes held the same fascination, watching each horse with the intensity of someone memorizing details for a test she couldn't afford to fail. Eli positioned himself where he could observe both the auction and the girl without appearing too obvious. During the third lot, a pair of draft horses that went for more than they were worth, he noticed something that made his chest tighten with concern. A torn school photograph fluttered past in the wind, and the girl lunged forward to catch it, pressing it against her chest with a desperation that spoke of precious few possessions. When she thought no one was watching, she smoothed the photograph and studied it with the careful attention of someone trying to preserve a fading memory. Eli caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a school class picture, the kind taken every year to mark the passage of time and growth. "That's Sarah Mitchell," said a voice behind him. Eli turned to find Tom Henderson, Walt's grandson, who'd been managing some of his grandfather's affairs since the old man's death. "She's staying with the Hendersons temporarily. Foster situation, from what I understand." The Hendersons. Eli knew them peripherally, an English couple in their 50s who lived about 3 miles from his farm. Good people, he'd heard, though. They'd struggled with troubles of their own over the years. "Foster care?" Eli asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Her parents died in a car accident last spring," Tom explained, lowering his voice out of respect for tragedy. "She's been moved around a bit since then. The Hendersons are trying to help, but they've got their hands full with their own grandson living there now too. Kid's been having some troubles." Eli watched as Sarah, now she had a name, carefully folded the photograph and tucked it into her jacket pocket. 8 years old, maybe 9, carrying the weight of loss that most adults struggle to bear. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. She reminded him of Rebecca, not just in appearance, but in that particular expression children wear when they've learned that the world can change without warning or mercy. "She comes here every week?" he asked. "Regular as clockwork. Mrs. Patterson from Social Services thinks it's good for her. Gives her something to look forward to, helps with the adjustment, though I'm not sure how much adjusting a kid that age should have to do." Mrs. Patterson. The name filed itself away in Eli's mind, alongside other details he wasn't sure why he was collecting. The auction continued around them, but Eli found his attention divided between the livestock and the small figure near the fence. When Sarah moved closer to get a better view of a particularly spirited mare, he noticed something that made his stomach clench with a protective anger he hadn't felt in years. Bruises. Small ones, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, marking her upper arms in the telltale pattern of adult fingers gripping too hard. Not abuse, necessarily, but handling that lacked the gentleness a child deserved. During the lunch break, when most spectators wandered toward the food trucks or headed home, Sarah remained by the fence. Eli approached slowly, the way he might approach a skittish animal, and stopped a respectful distance away. "Beautiful horses today," he said quietly. She glanced up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "The bay mare," she said after a moment. "She reminds me of a horse from a book I used to have." Used to have. Past tense. Everything in her young life seemed to exist in past tense. "What was the book about?" Eli asked, settling against the fence. Rail, as if he had all the time in the world. "A girl who lived on a farm and took care of animals," Sarah said. "Her grandfather taught her about horses and how to read their moods by watching their ears and eyes." "Your grandfather taught you things like that?" She shook her head, and for a moment her composure wavered. "I don't have a grandfather anymore, or a grandmother, or parents." The words came out flat, recited like facts she'd been forced to memorize. Eli felt something shift inside his chest, a stirring he hadn't experienced since Martha's death, the urge to fix something, to make something better for someone who deserved better than the hand life had dealt them. "I'm Eli," he said simply. "Sarah." She studied his face with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to read adults quickly. "You're Amish." "I am." "Do you have horses?" "2. Work horses mostly, but gentle enough for riding when the work's done." For the first time, something that might have been hope flickered in her expression. "I've never ridden a horse." "Would you like to?" The words came out before he'd fully considered them, driven by an impulse that bypassed his usual careful deliberation. Sarah's eyes widened, but before she could answer, a sharp voice cut across the distance between them. "Sarah! Get away from there right now!" A woman approached with hurried steps, her face flushed with annoyance and something that might have been embarrassment. She grabbed Sarah's arm with the casual roughness that explained the bruises, her grip firm enough to make the girl wince. "I'm sorry if she was bothering you," the woman said to Eli, her tone carrying the exhausted edge of someone dealing with more than she could handle. "She's supposed to stay close to me." "No bother at all," Eli replied, watching as Sarah's expression closed off like a door slamming shut. "She was just admiring the horses." "Well, she needs to learn that wanting things doesn't mean you get them." The woman's words carried an harshness that made Eli's jaw tighten. "Come on, Sarah, we need to get back." As they walked away, Sarah glanced back once, and in that look, Eli saw something that would haunt him through the coming weeks. A mixture of longing and resignation that no child should have to carry. He remained by the fence long after they'd disappeared, watching the horses mill around in their holding pens and thinking about little girls who memorized animals they couldn't have, and carried torn photographs like treasure. The afternoon had grown colder, and the wind carried the scent of coming rain. That evening, sitting in his kitchen with a cup of coffee growing cold beside him, Eli found himself thinking about Rebecca again. His brother's daughter had visited every summer until she turned 12, filling the house with laughter and questions that challenged everything he thought he understood about children and responsibility. He remembered teaching her to milk cows, watching her face light up with pride when she managed to fill the bucket without spilling. He remembered her tears when it was time to leave, and his own hollow feeling when the house returned to its quiet routine. But most of all, he remembered the last summer she'd visited when David had come to collect her earlier than planned. There'd been an argument, voices raised in the barn, accusations about narrow-mindedness and stubborn tradition that still echoed in Eli's memory. "She needs more than this," David had said, gesturing around the farm as if it were a prison instead of a sanctuary. "She needs choices, opportunities, a chance to discover who she's supposed to become." "She needs stability," Eli had countered. "She needs to know where she belongs and what's expected of her." "She needs love," David had shot back, "and love sometimes means letting go of your own certainty about what's right." Eli had dismissed his brother's words then, written them off, as the confused philosophy of someone who'd lost his way. But now, thinking about Sarah's resigned expression and the careful way she'd handled that torn photograph, he wondered if David had understood something about children and love that Eli was only beginning to grasp. Outside, the first drops of rain began tapping against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, thunder announced the coming storm. Eli sat in his quiet kitchen, surrounded by the accumulated silence of 3 years of solitude, and felt the first stirring of something that might have been purpose. The small wooden horse took shape slowly under Eli's careful hands, each cut of the whittling knife deliberate and purposeful. He'd found himself working on it without conscious decision, his fingers moving through familiar motions while his mind wrestled with thoughts that had no easy resolution. The horse was smaller than his usual carvings, sized for small hands to hold, though he couldn't quite admit to himself why that seemed important. Thursday morning found him in town earlier than usual, parking his buggy outside the Lancaster County Public Library, with the awkward awareness that his presence there would be noted and discussed. Amish men didn't typically spend time researching topics they could learn through community wisdom and experience, but community wisdom had never prepared him for questions about foster care and children who carried torn photographs like lifelines. The librarian, a kind-faced Englishwoman named Helen Morrison, had known Eli peripherally for years through his occasional visits to research farming techniques or historical questions for church presentations. She seemed surprised but pleased to help him navigate the computer system and locate information about Pennsylvania's child welfare services. What he learned made his chest tighten with a mixture of sadness and anger. Children moved through the system like cargo, staying in temporary placements until permanent homes could be found or relatives came forward to claim them. The statistics painted a picture of overwhelmed caseworkers, insufficient resources, and too many children whose lives had been disrupted by tragedy or family breakdown. Foster care is supposed to be temporary, Helen explained quietly, noticing his concentration on the screen. But temporary can stretch into months or years when the right placement is hard to find. What makes a placement right? Eli asked, genuinely curious about terminology that seemed both clinical and deeply personal. Stability, mostly. Families that can provide consistent care, emotional support, and a sense of belonging. It's more complicated than it sounds, especially for children who've experienced significant trauma. Trauma. The word settled in Eli's mind, alongside his memory of Sarah's careful composure and two old eyes. He thought about the bruises on her arms, the way she'd flinched when the woman grabbed her, and felt a protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. After leaving the library, Eli found himself driving past the social services office on Market Street. The building looked official and impersonal, the kind of place where life-changing decisions were made by people who dealt with tragedy as routine business. He sat in his buggy across the street for nearly an hour, gathering courage to walk inside and ask questions he wasn't sure he was ready to have answered. Mrs. Patricia Patterson turned out to be a woman in her 40s with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much heartbreak to be shocked by anything. She listened to Eli's carefully prepared questions with professional courtesy, though her expression showed surprise when he identified himself as the man who'd spoken with Sarah at the horse auction. "Sarah's situation is complicated," she said, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood confidentiality laws but recognized genuine concern. "She's been through several placements since her parents died, and each move becomes more difficult for a child her age." "The Hendersons seem overwhelmed," Eli observed. Mrs. Patterson's slight nod confirmed what he'd suspected. "They're good people, but they're dealing with their own family challenges right now. Their grandson has some behavioral issues that require a lot of attention, and adding Sarah to the mix has proven more difficult than anyone anticipated." "What happens if that placement doesn't work out?" "We'll find another family willing to take her temporarily, and we'll keep looking for a permanent solution. Sarah needs stability, but she also needs people who understand that healing from loss takes time and patience." Eli left the meeting with more questions than answers, but also with Mrs. Patterson's business card and a tentative understanding that his interest in Sarah's welfare was both noted and appreciated. The drive home took him past the Henderson farm, and he found himself slowing as he approached their driveway, though he couldn't say what he hoped to accomplish by lingering. That evening, Jacob and Ruth arrived for their weekly visit, bringing news from the community and Ruth's famous apple pie. They settled in Eli's kitchen with the comfortable familiarity of decades-old friendship. though Ruth's sharp eyes noticed changes in the house, small alterations that suggested Eli's routine was shifting in subtle ways. "You've been spending a time away from the farm," Ruth observed, not quite a question, but clearly inviting explanation. "A man can't become hermit just because his wife dies," Eli replied, cutting generous slices of pie and avoiding her searching gaze. "No, but a man can develop interests that worry his friends," Jacob added gently. "Bishop Samuel mentioned you've been asking questions about English children and their care arrangements." Of course, Samuel had heard. In a community their size, conversations with social workers and library visits were noted and reported with the concerned efficiency of people who understood that individual choices affected everyone. "I met a child who seemed to need kindness," Eli said simply. "Since when is Christian compassion cause for concern?" "Since it involves entangling ourselves with English legal systems and social problems that our community isn't equipped to handle," Ruth replied, though her tone carried more worry than criticism. "Eli, we understand your heart is in the right place, but there are proper channels for charitable impulses." "Through the church," Jacob agreed. "Through established organizations that know how to help without compromising our separation from worldly systems." They talked for another hour, with Ruth and Jacob expressing their concerns with the gentle persistence of friends who'd known each other long enough to speak honestly about difficult topics. Eli listened, appreciating their care while feeling increasingly certain that established channels and proper procedures wouldn't address what he'd seen in Sarah's eyes. After they left, he returned to his whittling, working by lamplight until the wooden horse achieved the smooth finish he'd been seeking. The toy was simple but well-crafted, sized perfectly for a child to hold and play with, though he still couldn't quite acknowledge why that mattered. Friday brought rain that drummed against his windows and kept him inside, working on household tasks he'd been postponing. In Martha's sewing room, he found himself sorting through fabric pieces she'd collected for future quilting projects. Her organizational system had been meticulous, colors sorted by shade, patterns arranged by size, everything labeled in her careful handwriting. Among the fabric pieces, he discovered something that made him pause. A small bag of scraps labeled, "For children's quilts, bright colors and cheerful patterns." Martha had never mentioned making children's quilts, but here was evidence of a plan or dream she'd kept private. The fabrics were different from her usual choices, whimsical patterns with farm animals, bright primary colors that would appeal to young eyes. The discovery stirred something in Eli's chest, a recognition that Martha had harbored hopes and dreams she'd never shared with him. Perhaps she'd imagined grandchildren who might visit, or neighborhood children who might benefit from her skill and generosity. Perhaps she'd simply liked the idea of creating something beautiful for the young people who represented hope and continuity. Saturday morning brought unexpected visitors. Bishop Samuel arrived with Deacon Aaron Miller, their expressions serious enough to indicate this wasn't a casual social call. Eli invited them inside, offering coffee and trying to read the purpose behind their presence from their careful politeness. "We understand you've been spending time learning about English social services," Bishop Samuel began without preamble. "Such interests raise questions about your intentions and your commitment to our community's values." "My intentions are Christian compassion," Eli replied, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "Since when does caring about a child's welfare conflict with our values? When it involves inserting ourselves into English legal systems and social problems that could compromise our separation from worldly entanglements," Aaron answered. "Our community's strength comes from maintaining clear boundaries between our life and theirs." They talked for nearly 2 hours. with Samuel and Aaron expressing concerns about precedent, community stability, and the risks of individual members becoming too deeply involved with outside institutions. Eli listened, understanding their perspective while feeling increasingly certain that their well-intentioned caution might prevent him from responding to what felt like a calling he couldn't ignore. "I appreciate your concern," he said finally, "but I believe God sometimes asks us to show mercy in ways that don't fit our comfortable routines. And I believe God expects us to be wise as serpents while remaining harmless as doves," Samuel replied. "Wisdom includes recognizing when our good intentions might lead us into situations we're not prepared to handle." After they left, Eli sat in his quiet kitchen, holding the small wooden horse and thinking about children who needed more than wisdom and caution could provide. Outside, the October afternoon was fading into evening, and somewhere across the valley, Sarah was spending another day in a temporary home with people who seemed overwhelmed by her presence. The foster care application papers lay on Eli's kitchen table like a challenge to everything he'd believed about his own capabilities and calling. He'd crumpled them twice and smoothed them out again, the creases marking his indecision as clearly as worry lines marked his face. 3 sleepless nights had passed since Mrs. Patterson had explained the process, and each dawn found him no closer to certainty about the path forward. Tuesday had brought another encounter with Sarah at the horse auction, and this time the signs of distress were impossible to ignore. She'd appeared with a fresh bruise on her cheek, not from abuse, Mrs. Patterson had assured him later, but from a scuffle with the Hendersons' grandson that had escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. The boy was dealing with his own trauma, acting out in ways that made Sarah's quiet presence seem like an additional burden, rather than the blessing Eli believed children should represent. "She's not thriving there," Mrs. Patterson had said during their private conversation after the auction. "The Hendersons are doing their best, but sometimes the best intentions aren't enough when family dynamics become complicated." Now, staring at the application papers in the lamplight, Eli found himself thinking about David for the first time in months, without the accompanying surge of frustration and disappointment. His brother had left the community 20 years ago, choosing a path that led to questions rather than answers, uncertainty rather than the comfort of established tradition. David had married an English woman, raised his daughter Rebecca in a world where choices multiplied like weeds in an untended garden, where faith competed with doubt and tradition bent beneath the weight of individual interpretation. Eli had judged those choices harshly, seeing them as abandonment of everything their father had taught them about the importance of community, stability, and unwavering commitment to proven ways of living. But tonight, surrounded by papers that could change the direction of his entire existence, Eli wondered if his brother had understood something about love that he was only beginning to grasp. Perhaps sometimes caring for someone required stepping outside the boundaries of comfort and certainty. Perhaps love demanded actions that couldn't be justified through traditional channels or community approval. The memories surfaced unbidden. Rebecca, at age 10, crying in the barn because her father had come to collect her earlier than planned. There'd been an argument between the brothers, voices raised in anger that still echoed in Eli's conscience. "She needs more than this narrow world can give her," David had said, his gesture encompassing the farm as if it were a prison rather than a sanctuary. "She needs choices, opportunities, the chance to discover who God made her to be. She needs stability," Eli had countered, with the certainty of someone who'd never questioned the foundation beneath his feet. "She needs to know where she belongs and what's expected of her. She needs love," David had shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. "And sometimes love means letting go of your own certainty about what's right for someone else." Eli had dismissed the words then, written them off as the confused philosophy of someone who'd lost his spiritual moorings. But now, thinking about Sarah's resigned expression and the careful way she protected that torn photograph, he wondered if David had possessed wisdom that Eli was only beginning to understand. The application asked questions that forced him to examine assumptions he'd held for decades. Did he understand the challenges of raising a traumatized child? Could he provide access to counseling services and educational opportunities that might conflict with Amish traditions? Was he prepared to navigate legal systems and social services that operated according to principles very different from those governing his community? Each question revealed the complexity of loving a child whose needs might extend beyond the boundaries of his familiar world. Eli had never considered the possibility that his calling might require him to bridge two worlds, to remain faithful to his community while also meeting obligations that originated outside its borders. Thursday morning brought unexpected rain and an even more unexpected visitor. Ruth appeared at his door, carrying a basket of fresh bread and wearing the determined expression she reserved for conversations that couldn't be postponed or avoided. "Jacob thinks I shouldn't interfere," she said without preamble, settling herself at his kitchen table as if prepared for a siege. "But Jacob doesn't understand that sometimes a woman recognizes things a man might miss." Eli poured coffee and waited for her to continue, recognizing the signs of someone who'd been rehearsing. A difficult conversation. "Martha wanted children," Ruth said simply. "Not just wanted, yearned for them with the kind of longing that carves hollows in a woman's heart. She never spoke of it directly, but I knew. We talked around it, the way women do when the subject touches too deep for casual words." The statement hit Eli like a physical blow. He'd known, of course, that their childlessness had been a source of sadness for Martha, but he'd assumed she'd made peace with it the way he had, accepting it as God's will and focusing on the blessings they did possess. "She never said," he began. "Of course she didn't say," Ruth interrupted gently. "You were grieving too in your own way. She protected you from her deepest sorrow the same way you protected her from yours." Ruth reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over his. "I've watched you these past weeks, seen the changes in your routine and the questions in your eyes. If Martha were here, she'd tell you that sometimes God answers prayers in ways we never expected, at times we never imagined possible." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both lost in memories of a woman who'd shaped their understanding of love through her quiet presence and selfless devotion. Finally, Ruth spoke again. "The community will have concerns," she said practically. "Bishop Samuel fears precedent, and Aaron worries about compromise with worldly systems. But I remember when Martha miscarried the second time, how she held that stillborn baby and whispered about angels needing mothers too." The revelation hit Eli with stunning force. "Miscarried? When? How many times?" "Twice," Ruth said softly. "Once during your 3rd year of marriage, once during your 8th. She was 4 months along the second time, far enough that she'd begun imagining nursery arrangements and choosing names." Ruth's voice carried the weight of secrets kept faithfully for decades. "She made me promise never to tell you, afraid it would add to your own grief." Eli felt the foundation of his understanding shift beneath him, like sand giving way to flood. Water. All those years, when he'd assumed they were united in accepting childlessness as God's plan, Martha had been carrying the weight of specific losses, grieving children who'd existed long enough to be loved and hoped for and lost. She used to say that maybe God was preparing her for a different kind of motherhood, Ruth continued. Maybe children would come to her in ways she hadn't expected, at times when she was ready to love them with the fullness of experience rather than the innocence of youth. The foster care application lay between them on the table, its questions suddenly seeming less like obstacles and more like opportunities to honor dreams Martha had never been able to speak aloud. Eli smoothed the crumpled papers with hands that trembled slightly, seeing them now as a bridge between the love he'd shared with his wife and the love he might share with a child who needed what they could have provided together. "The process will be complicated," he said, speaking as much to himself as to Ruth. "All the best things are complicated," she replied. "Simple things rarely require faith." That evening, Eli sat at his kitchen table with a pen in his hand and 37 years of marriage informing every word he wrote on the application. He answered questions about his background, his financial stability, his understanding of childhood trauma, and his willingness to work within systems that might challenge his traditional approaches to child rearing. When he reached the section asking about his motivation for seeking foster placement, he paused for a long time, listening to the silence that had defined his house since Martha's death. Finally he wrote, "My wife and I were never blessed with biological children, but we always believed our home was meant to be a place where a child could grow in love and security. I believe God is offering me an opportunity to fulfill that. Calling by caring for a child who has already experienced too much loss and needs the stability of a permanent home." He signed the application with the same careful precision he brought to all important documents, then folded it neatly and placed it in an envelope addressed to Mrs. Patterson. Tomorrow he would drive to town and mail it, officially beginning a process that would either fulfill what felt like divine calling or prove his unsuitability for a responsibility that required more wisdom than he possessed. Outside, the October wind moved through bare trees with the sound of change approaching, and somewhere in the darkness, a child who watched horses with the intensity of someone memorizing joy was spending another night in a temporary home, unaware that an aging Amish widower was taking the first steps toward offering her something she'd never had before, the promise of permanence in a world that had taught her that everything precious could disappear without warning. The wooden horse sat on, his windowsill smooth and ready, waiting for small hands to claim it as treasure. Bishop Samuel's walking stick struck the porch boards with the measured rhythm of authority as he approached Eli's door on a grey November morning. The stick was carved with scripture verses in the old German script, each word worn smooth by decades of contemplation and use. Today, it seemed less a support for aging joints and more a symbol of the weight traditional wisdom carried in conversations that challenged established boundaries. Eli had been expecting this visit since mailing his foster care application 2 weeks earlier. News traveled through their community with the efficiency of wind through wheat fields, and his intentions had become the subject of careful discussion among families who understood that individual choices rippled outward to affect everyone. "Good morning, Samuel," Eli said, opening his door with the respect due a man who'd guided their community through 40 years of social change and spiritual challenges. "Coffee?" "This isn't a social visit," Samuel replied, though he accepted the invitation inside and settled into the kitchen chair that creaked familiarly under his substantial frame. At 71, the bishop possessed the kind of presence that filled rooms and commanded attention without effort. They sat across from each other at the table, where Eli had filled out application papers, the morning light casting long shadows that seemed to underscore the gravity of their conversation. Samuel's weathered hands rested on his walking stick, and his grey eyes held the patient intensity of someone accustomed to guiding others through difficult decisions. "You've submitted papers to become a foster parent," Samuel said without preamble. "Such a decision affects not just you, but our entire community's relationship with English social systems." "It affects a child who needs a home," Eli replied carefully. "Since when do we turn away from opportunities to show Christian love? Since those opportunities require us to entangle ourselves with government agencies that don't understand our way of life," Samuel answered. What happens when social services demands that the child receive counseling that conflicts with our beliefs? What happens when the state requires educational programs we can't provide? What happens when they decide our community isn't suitable for raising an English child? The questions carried weight because they reflected genuine concerns rather than simple resistance to change. Samuel had spent decades protecting their community from outside pressures that could compromise their religious freedom and cultural autonomy. His caution came from experience with government agencies that sometimes viewed Amish practices with suspicion or misunderstanding. Mrs. Patterson says they're looking for stability and love, Eli said. We've provided both for our own children for generations. Our own children are born into our community, raised with our values from birth, Samuel replied. This child comes from a different world, with different expectations and different needs. Can you provide access to the counseling services she'll require? Can you help her maintain connections to English culture if that's what the court demands? The conversation continued for over an hour, with Samuel raising practical concerns about legal obligations, community precedent, and the potential for conflict between Amish traditions and state requirements for child welfare. Eli listened with growing understanding that his decision to pursue foster care represented more than personal calling. It challenged fundamental assumptions about their community's relationship with the outside world. I respect your concerns, Eli said finally, but I believe God sometimes calls us to step outside our comfort to serve those in need. And I believe God expects us to be wise stewards of the community He's entrusted to our care, Samuel replied, his tone carrying the weight of spiritual authority. Your individual choice could set precedent that affects our children and grandchildren for generations. After Samuel left, Eli found himself in his workshop, working on farm tools that needed sharpening and repair. The familiar motions provided comfort while his mind struggled with questions that had no easy answers. Was his calling genuine, or was he projecting his own loneliness onto a child's situation? Could he provide what Sarah needed while maintaining his commitment to community values that had sustained him for 63 years? The parenting classes began the following week in a conference room at the Social Services building. Eli arrived early, parking his buggy among cars and pickup trucks, aware that his presence drew curious glances from other prospective foster parents. The group was small, 6 individuals or couples who'd completed initial screenings and committed to the training process required for certification. Mrs. Patterson led the sessions with professional competence and genuine compassion, covering topics that ranged from childhood trauma to legal responsibilities to practical caregiving strategies. Eli found himself taking notes in a composition book, recording information about attachment disorders, behavioral challenges, and therapeutic approaches that existed far outside his previous experience. Children who've experienced loss and instability often test boundaries in ways that can be exhausting for caregivers, she explained during the second session. They're not being deliberately difficult. They're trying to determine whether this new situation is truly safe or just another temporary stop before the next disruption. The other participants asked questions that revealed their own uncertainties and concerns. A young couple worried about balancing their biological children's needs with a foster child's requirements. An older woman wondered whether her traditional parenting approaches would be adequate for children who'd experienced trauma. A middle-aged man questioned his ability to provide emotional support for teenagers who'd been through the legal system. Eli's questions focused on practical matters: how to access counseling services from their rural location, how to maintain a child's connection to their cultural background while introducing them to Amish life, how to navigate potential conflicts between community expectations and state requirements. During the third week of classes, Mrs. Patterson, he pulled him aside after the group session. "Sarah's situation has become more urgent," she said quietly. "The placement with the Hendersons isn't working out, and we need to move her to another temporary home while we continue processing permanent applications." "What happened?" Eli asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The family dynamics have become too stressful for everyone involved. Their grandson's behavioral issues have escalated, and Sarah has begun withdrawing in ways that suggest she's feeling responsible for the household tension." The news hit Eli with a mixture of sadness and determination. Sarah was being moved again, experiencing another disruption in a young life that had already endured too much instability. She would pack her few belongings, say goodbye to whatever familiar routines she'd established, and begin the process of adjustment all over again with strangers who might or might not understand her needs. "How long before my application is processed?" he asked. "Normally 6 to 8 weeks from submission, but given Sarah's specific circumstances and your completion of training classes, we could potentially expedite the home study and evaluation process." That evening, Eli found himself in Martha's sewing room, examining the fabric pieces she'd collected for children's quilts. The bright colors and whimsical patterns seemed to carry her hopes forward into a future she hadn't lived to see. He selected fabrics carefully, imagining how they might be arranged into a quilt small enough for a child's bed, something cheerful and comforting that could provide continuity through transitions and changes. Ruth arrived the next morning with her sewing basket and a determined expression that suggested she'd made decisions during the night. "If we're going to make a quilt for this child, we better start now," she said without preamble. "And if you're going to become a foster father, you'd better understand that children require more than good intentions and Christian love." They spent the morning cutting fabric pieces and discussing the practical realities of child rearing. Ruth had raised 4 children of her own and helped with countless grandchildren, giving her insights into everything from bedtime routines to discipline, strategies to the importance of consistency and daily schedules. "Martha would have been wonderful with children," Ruth said as they worked. "She had the patience for their questions and the wisdom to know when guidance was needed and when independence should be encouraged." "I'm not Martha," Eli replied, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger as the reality of his decision became more concrete. "No, but you loved her well for 37 years, Ruth answered. "That kind of love doesn't disappear. It finds new ways to express itself." As November deepened into the cold that preceded winter, Eli found himself caught between 2 worlds: his familiar community with its established rhythms and expectations, and an unfamiliar realm of social services, legal requirements, and child psychology that operated according to different principles entirely. The tension was uncomfortable, but not unbearable, like wearing clothes that fit imperfectly but served their essential purpose. The wooden horse remained on his windowsill, waiting for small hands to claim it, while in Martha's sewing room a child's quilt slowly took shape beneath Ruth's expert guidance and Eli's careful stitches. Both objects represented faith in a future he could envision, but not yet guarantee. A future where his house might once again echo with voices other than his own, where the empty chair at his dinner table might be filled by someone who needed what he had to offer. Sarah's tattered teddy bear had seen better decades. The brown fur was worn thin in places where small hands had clutched it through countless nights, and one ear showed the careful stitching of a repair job done with love, if not professional skill. She held it protectively during her first supervised visit with Eli at the county office, as if the bear contained every memory worth preserving from a life that had already changed too many times. "His name is Mr. Buttons," she told Eli quietly, adjusting the bear's position so he could see better from her lap. "He's been with me since I was really little, before my parents died." They sat in a small room designed to feel comfortable rather than institutional. with soft chairs and children's books scattered on low tables. Mrs. Patterson had explained that these initial visits were meant to help determine compatibility between potential foster families and children, but the clinical terminology couldn't capture the weight of two people trying to decide whether they could trust each other with their most vulnerable hopes. "He looks like he's been a good friend," Eli said, noticing how carefully Sarah protected the bear while still allowing him to be part of their conversation. "He listens to everything and never tells secrets," she replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom of someone who'd learned the value of reliable companions. "Do you have any pets on your farm?" "2 horses, some chickens, and a barn cat who thinks she owns the place," Eli answered. "The cat's name is Patches because she's got markings that look like a quilt pattern." For the first time since they'd been introduced an hour earlier, Sarah's expression showed genuine interest rather than polite caution. "Does she let people pet her?" "She's particular about who she trusts, but once she decides you're acceptable, she'll follow you around like a shadow." They talked about animals for the remainder of their visit, with Sarah asking detailed questions about horse care and farming, routines that suggested she'd been thinking about such things for weeks. Eli found himself describing his daily chores in ways that made them sound like adventures rather than work, sharing stories about calves learning to walk and chickens who'd figured out how to open gate latches. When the visit ended, Sarah hugged Mr. Buttons closer and looked at Eli with eyes that held both hope and the careful reserve of someone who'd learned not to expect too much from adult promises. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "If you'd like to," Eli replied. "Mrs. Patterson says we can have another visit next week, maybe at my farm, so you can meet Patches and see the horses." The drive home took him through countryside that looked different somehow, as if seeing it through a child's eyes had revealed details he'd stopped noticing after decades of familiarity. He found himself mentally cataloguing things that might interest Sarah: the old oak tree with branches perfect for climbing, the creek that ran through his back pasture, the barn loft where swallows nested each spring. That evening brought an unexpected phone call from his brother David. They'd maintained minimal contact since their argument 20 years earlier, exchanging Christmas cards and brief updates on health and weather, but avoiding deeper conversations that might reopen old wounds. "Ruth called me," David said without preamble, his voice carrying the peculiar clarity that long-distance connections sometimes provided. "She says you're thinking about becoming a foster father." "I've submitted the application," Eli replied carefully. "The home study is next week, and the community. Samuel must be having opinions about this development." Eli found himself smiling at his brother's diplomatic phrasing. "Samuel has concerns about precedent and proper boundaries. You'd probably agree with some of his points. I'd probably agree that love sometimes requires stepping outside comfortable boundaries," David answered. "How are you handling the bureaucracy? Government agencies and Amish sensibilities don't always align smoothly." They talked for nearly an hour, with David sharing insights from his own experience navigating systems that operated according to different principles than those governing their childhood community. His daughter, Rebecca, was now married with children of her own, living in Ohio and working as a teacher in an elementary school that served both Amish and English families. "She still talks about those summers at your farm," David said. "Says you taught her that caring for things, animals, plants, people, requires both patience and consistency." "I remember her crying when it was time to leave that last summer," Eli said quietly. "She wasn't just crying about leaving the farm," David replied. "She was crying because she could feel the tension between us, knew that our argument meant she might not be welcome there anymore." The statement hung in the air between them, carrying 20 years of unspoken regret and missed opportunities for reconciliation, Finally, David continued, "If you decide to go through with this foster care arrangement, you'll need support from family who understand both worlds. Rebecca would be happy to help however she can. She knows about child development, educational resources, therapeutic services that might be useful." After they ended the call, Eli sat in his quiet kitchen, thinking about bridges burned and bridges that might still be rebuilt. His decision to pursue foster care was opening connections he hadn't expected, forcing him to reconsider relationships he'd written off as irreconcilable differences. The home study visit took place on a Thursday morning when November sunshine made his farm look like a postcard advertising rural tranquility. Mrs. Patterson arrived with a clipboard full of forms and a thorough agenda for evaluating everything from fire safety measures to sleeping arrangements to community support systems. They walked through every room of his house, with Mrs. Patterson taking notes about safety latches on cabinets, the proximity of his neighbor's farm, and the adequacy of the small bedroom he'd begun preparing as Sarah's space. The room had been Martha's sewing room, but he'd moved her equipment to create space for a child-sized bed and dresser. "The community support network is impressive," Mrs. Patterson observed after meeting with Jacob and Ruth, who'd arrived to answer questions about their willingness to help with childcare and emergency situations. "Not every foster placement has access to this kind of extended family system. We take care of our own," Ruth said simply. "And if Eli believes this child belongs in our community, then she belongs." The evaluation continued with discussions about Eli's financial stability, his understanding of childhood trauma, and his plans for accessing required services like counseling and medical care. Some questions were easier to answer than others. His farm provided adequate income, his parenting classes had prepared him for common challenges, and the county hospital was only 20 minutes away by buggy. But other questions revealed complexities he was still learning to navigate. How would he handle conflicts between Amish traditions and therapeutic recommendations? What if Sarah needed educational services that weren't available through their one-room schoolhouse? How would he maintain her connection to English culture while introducing her to Amish life? "Foster care requires flexibility," Mrs. Patterson explained. "Children who've experienced trauma often need individualized approaches that don't fit standard procedures or traditional expectations." 2 weeks later, she called with news that made his hands shake as he held the phone receiver. "Your application has been approved," she said. "Sarah's current placement is ending sooner than expected, and we'd like to arrange the transition as quickly as possible." The current placement was ending because Sarah had been found hiding in a closet at 3 in the morning, fully dressed and clutching a backpack containing her few possessions. She'd been preparing to run away, convinced that her presence was causing problems she couldn't solve, and that leaving might make things better for everyone. "She's not acting out or being difficult," Mrs. Patterson explained during their final preparation meeting. "She's trying to protect herself and others from what she perceives as her disruptive influence. That kind of self-blame is common among children who've experienced multiple placement changes." The day before Sarah's arrival, Eli found himself walking through his house with new eyes, trying to see it as a frightened child might. The rooms were clean and comfortable, but undeniably masculine, lacking the soft touches that Martha had provided. Ruth had helped him add some feminine elements: colorful curtains in Sarah's room, a few books about horses and farm animals, a small lamp that cast warm light instead of harsh brightness. The child's quilt lay folded on the bed they'd purchased specifically for her, a simple wooden frame that wouldn't overwhelm the small room but would provide security and comfort. Ruth had finished the sewing 2 days earlier, creating a cheerful pattern of farm animals and flowers that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. That evening, Eli sat at his kitchen table with the wooden horse in his hands, thinking about The leap of faith required to love someone whose history he barely understood. Tomorrow, a child who'd already lost everything once would arrive at his farm carrying a tattered teddy bear and the accumulated weight of too much change, too much loss, too much uncertainty about where she belonged. He thought about Martha's hidden dreams of children's quilts and her belief that some gifts arrived in unexpected packages. He thought about David's words about love, requiring the release of certainty about what was right. And he thought about a little girl who watched horses with the intensity of someone memorizing joy against the possibility that it might disappear without warning. Outside, the November wind moved through bare trees with the sound of winter approaching. But inside his house, preparations were complete for the arrival of someone who might transform silence into something warmer, emptiness into something fuller, and solitude into the kind of companionship that made even difficult days feel like blessings in disguise. Martha's hidden journal lay beneath layers of tissue paper in the bottom of her cedar chest, discovered only when Eli was making room for Sarah's belongings. The leather-bound book was small enough to fit in a woman's hand, its pages filled with Martha's careful script, documenting thoughts she'd never shared aloud. Finding it felt like receiving a letter from beyond the grave, a final conversation with the woman who'd shaped his understanding of love and loss. The entries began during their second year of marriage and continued until just months before Martha's death. Reading them in the lamplight of his kitchen, Eli discovered a parallel narrative to their shared life. Martha's private struggles with their childlessness, her hope and despair, cycling through seasons of possibility and disappointment. March 15, 1987. I was 3 months along before I told Eli, wanting to be certain this time. The bleeding started this morning, and I can't bear to see the hope die in his eyes again. Dr. Matthews says these things happen, that it doesn't mean we won't have children eventually, but my heart feels too broken for eventually. June 2nd, 1987. Eli has been so gentle since the miscarriage, treating me like I'm made of glass that might shatter with the wrong word or touch. I wish I could tell him that sharing the grief would make it lighter for both of us, but he needs to believe I'm healing, so I pretend to be stronger than I feel. October 18th, 1992. 4 months this time, long enough that I'd started imagining nursery colors and choosing names. Rebecca, if it was a girl, after Eli's grandmother. Thomas, if it was a boy, for my father. Long enough that losing him, I think of this one as him, feels like losing a real person instead of just a possibility. The journal revealed Martha's hidden landscape of longing and loss, her private conversations with God about the children who existed only in her dreams and prayers. Eli read with growing amazement about a woman he'd lived with for 37 years, but never fully known, a woman who'd protected him from her deepest sorrow while carrying it alone. December 3rd, 1995. Watched David's Rebecca help with the Christmas baking today. She has such careful hands for a 7-year-old, measuring ingredients like she's afraid of making mistakes. I wonder if this is how motherhood feels, watching small miracles of concentration and hoping your guidance helps rather than hinders their growth. May 14th, 2001. The doctor confirmed what I already knew. There will be no more possibilities for us. Eli cried when I told him, but I felt something that might have been relief mixed with the sadness. No more hoping, no more preparing, no more losing, just accepting what is and finding other ways to nurture the parts of me that were meant to be maternal. Page after page revealed Martha's evolution from desperate hoping to gradual acceptance to something that looked like wisdom about alternative forms of motherhood. She wrote about neighborhood children who visited their farm, about young mothers in their community who sought her advice, about her growing belief that love could express itself in ways that transcended biological connection. August 7th, 2010. There's a young mother in our district struggling with her colicky baby, Sarah Byler, barely 19 and overwhelmed by the relentless crying that no amount of rocking seems to soothe. I spent the afternoon with her today, holding little Jacob while she napped for the first time in weeks. When she woke, she said, "I had magic hands that could calm any baby." If only she knew how many years I've imagined holding a crying child of my own. November 23rd, 2018. The fabric store had the most beautiful children's patterns today, farm animals and bright flowers that would make cheerful quilts for little. Goodness, I bought more than I need, telling myself they're for the church auction, but really, I think I'm preparing for something I can't yet imagine. Maybe God has plans for these fabrics that I'm not ready to understand. The final entries, written during Martha's battle with cancer, carried a prophetic quality that made Eli's hands tremble as he read them. January 8th, 2022. The treatments are harder than I expected, but I find myself thinking about legacy in ways I never have before. What do we leave behind when we don't have children to carry our names or memories forward? Maybe love itself is the legacy, the way we've cared for each other, the kindness we've shown to others, the example of faithfulness we've tried to provide. March 17, 2022. Eli doesn't know how much time I have left, and I can't bear to tell him yet. But I need to write this down somewhere. I believe God is preparing him for a different kind of fatherhood than we expected. He has so much love to give, so much wisdom about gentleness and patience. When the time comes, I pray he'll recognize the opportunity and have courage to step forward into whatever form of parenthood God provides. June 4th, 2022. Had the strangest dream last night about a little girl with dark hair and serious eyes, standing in our kitchen and helping me make bread. When I woke, I could still smell the yeast and hear her laughter echoing in the silence. Dreams of children I'll never have shouldn't comfort me at this stage of life, but this one felt different, like a promise rather than a longing. Eli closed the journal and sat in the stillness of his kitchen, feeling the weight of revelation settle around him like snow. Martha had known things she'd never spoken, believed things she'd never shared, prepared for possibilities she'd never lived to see. Her hidden dreams hadn't died with her. They'd been waiting for the right moment to resurface and guide him toward fulfillment he'd never imagined. The next morning brought a phone call that shattered the careful plans he'd been making for Sarah's transition to his farm. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried tension that immediately put him on alert. "We've encountered a complication with Sarah's placement," she said without preamble. "Some distant relatives have come forward claiming interest in custody." "What kind of relatives?" Eli asked, though something in her tone suggested he wouldn't. Like the answer, her father's half-brother and his wife from California. They've hired an attorney and are challenging the foster care placement, saying family should have priority over non-relatives. The news hit Eli like a physical blow. He'd spent weeks preparing for Sarah's arrival, had completed parenting classes and home studies, had allowed himself to imagine a future that included her laughter in his quiet house. Now strangers with legal claims were threatening to unravel everything. "Do they have a legitimate case?" he asked. "Legally, yes. Blood relatives typically have priority in custody decisions, especially if they can demonstrate adequate resources and stable home environments. Their attorney is arguing that Sarah belongs with family members who share her cultural background, rather than in an Amish community that can't provide appropriate educational and social opportunities." The argument carried sting because it echoed concerns Bishop Samuel had raised about the compatibility between Amish life and the needs of an English child. But Eli had spent enough time with Sarah to know that cultural matching meant less than emotional connection, that stability came from love rather than shared background. "What do we know about these relatives?" he asked. "They live in Los Angeles, both work in entertainment industry. He's a talent agent, she's a production assistant. No children of their own, but they claim they want to provide Sarah with opportunities she can't access in rural Pennsylvania." Mrs. Patterson's tone suggested she had doubts about their motivations. "Their attorney contacted us after seeing Sarah's name in probate documents related to her parents' estate. Estate. The word carried implications that hadn't occurred to Eli before. Sarah's parents had died in a car accident, leaving behind property, insurance policies, and assets that would eventually pass to their daughter. Relatives who'd shown no interest in Sarah's welfare during the months she'd been in foster care were suddenly eager to claim custody after discovering she came with financial benefits. "They want the money," Eli said, understanding dawning with cold clarity. "We can't prove that, and we have to take their petition seriously," Mrs. Patterson replied. "But the timing is suspicious, and their lawyer's emphasis on Sarah's inheritance rights suggests financial considerations may be involved." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Mrs. Patterson explaining the legal process that would now unfold. Custody hearings, evaluations of all potential placements, court-appointed advocates for Sarah's interests, and a timeline that could stretch for months while lawyers argued about what was best for a child who'd already endured too much uncertainty. "What does Sarah know about this?" Eli asked. "Nothing yet. We're waiting until we have more information about the court schedule before explaining the situation to her." After ending the call, Eli found himself standing in the bedroom he'd prepared for Sarah, looking at the child's quilt Ruth had finished and the small collection of books and toys he'd gathered in anticipation of her arrival. The wooden horse sat on the windowsill where he'd placed it weeks earlier, waiting for small hands that might never claim it. He thought about Martha's journal entries, her belief that God was preparing him for unexpected parenthood, her dreams of a little girl with dark hair and serious eyes. Had those dreams been prophetic, or were they simply the wishful thinking of a woman who'd never stopped hoping for children of her own? That evening brought another unexpected phone call, this time from Bishop Samuel. "I've heard about the legal complications with the English child," Samuel said without preamble. "Perhaps this is God's way of sparing you from entanglements that could have created problems for our community. Or perhaps it's a test of whether I'm willing to fight for what I believe is right," Eli replied, surprised by the strength of his own conviction. "Fighting in English courts, using English lawyers to challenge English relatives. Does that sound like the path of simplicity and separation our people have followed for generations?" The question hung between them, carrying the weight of theological principle and practical wisdom. Samuel wasn't wrong about the complications this legal battle would create, the ways it would force Eli to navigate systems that operated according to very different values than those governing their community. But Eli thought about Sarah's expression when she'd asked if she would see him again, the careful way she protected her tattered teddy bear, the longing in her eyes when she talked about horses and farms, and the kind of stability she'd never known. Legal precedent and community concerns seemed less important than the simple fact that a child needed someone willing to fight for her welfare. "I'm going to contest their petition," Eli said finally. "Sarah belongs where she'll be loved, not where she'll provide financial benefits to relatives who ignored her existence until they learned about inheritance money. And if the court rules against you, if they decide that blood relatives in California can provide better opportunities than an Amish widower in Pennsylvania, then I'll have done what I could to protect a child who deserves better than being treated like a commodity," Eli answered. "Martha used to say that love requires action, not just good intentions." After Samuel ended the call with obvious disapproval, Eli opened Martha's journal again, rereading her final entries about dreams and preparation and the different forms parenthood might take. Her words seemed to carry weight beyond their original context, as if she'd foreseen this moment and left guidance for navigating it. He thought about the relatives in California who'd emerged from nowhere with legal claims and financial motivations, and he wondered what Sarah would think when she learned that her future was once again being decided by adults who viewed her as a problem to be solved rather than a child to be cherished. Outside, November wind moved through bare trees with the sound of winter approaching, and somewhere in the darkness a little girl was sleeping in another temporary bed, unaware that the stability she'd begun to hope for was now threatened by strangers who wanted to claim her for reasons that had nothing to do with love. Martha's journal lay open on the kitchen table, its pages filled with dreams that had waited decades for fulfillment. Eli traced his finger over her careful handwriting, reading once more her belief that God was preparing him for unexpected parenthood, and he felt something settle in his chest that might have been peace or might have been determination. Tomorrow, he would call Mrs. Patterson and begin the process of fighting for Sarah's right to remain where she was loved rather than where she was legally claimed. He would navigate courts and lawyers and custody battles that would test every principle he'd held about separation from worldly systems. But tonight, he sat with his wife's hidden dreams and his own growing certainty that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost to comfort or convenience. Some children were worth stepping outside familiar boundaries to protect, and some forms of love required more courage than he'd ever imagined possessing. The community petition lay spread across Eli's kitchen table like a map of fractured loyalties, each signature a declaration of where neighbors stood on the question that had divided Millbrook Valley more deeply than any issue in recent memory. Some names supported his fight for Sarah's custody with the bold strokes of people who believed love transcended legal technicalities. Others opposed his involvement with English court systems, their careful script reflecting concerns about precedent and community separation. Ruth had organized the petition drive without consulting Eli, her determination to support his cause, matched only by her frustration with neighbors who prioritized abstract principles over the welfare of a specific child. She'd gone door to door through their district, explaining the situation and asking for written statements that could be presented to the family court judge who would ultimately decide Sarah's future. 27 families support you, she announced, settling into his kitchen chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd completed a difficult task. 15 have concerns but wish you well. 8 think you're making a mistake that will compromise our community's standing with government authorities. The signatures told stories about relationships that stretched back generations and philosophical differences that ran deeper than Eli had realized. Jacob's bold handwriting anchored the support column, followed by the Miller family, the Bontrages, and other neighbors who'd watched Eli navigate grief with dignity and recognized his capacity for nurturing love. But notable absences marked the opposition as clearly as signatures marked support. Bishop Samuel's name appeared nowhere on the petition, his absence a diplomatic way of expressing disapproval without direct confrontation. Deacon Aaron Miller had signed, but with obvious reluctance, his cramped script suggesting internal conflict about proper boundaries between their community and outside institutions. "Samuel won't fight you publicly," Ruth observed, following Eli's gaze to the missing names. "But he won't support you either. He's worried that your individual choice could set precedent for other families who might want to adopt English children or involve themselves with social services." The legal battle had intensified over the past month, with Sarah's California relatives hiring an expensive attorney who specialized in custody disputes involving interstate relocations and cultural differences. Their petition painted Eli's Amish community as an isolated, backward environment that couldn't provide adequate educational opportunities or prepare Sarah for success in modern society. Meanwhile, Mrs. Patterson had arranged for character references from community members, psychological evaluations of all parties involved, and detailed assessments of both potential placements. The process felt intrusive and clinical, reducing complex human relationships to reports and recommendations that would influence a judge's decision about where Sarah belonged. The relative's lawyer is good, Eli's attorney Jennifer Walsh had warned during their last meeting. She's arguing that blood relatives in an urban environment can provide advantages that a rural Amish community simply cannot match. Access to specialized education, cultural opportunities, psychological services, and preparation for adult life in contemporary society. Jennifer was an English woman in her 40s who specialized in family law and had experience with cases involving religious communities. She'd taken Eli's case pro bono after Mrs. Patterson explained the circumstances, motivated by her own belief that children belonged with people who loved them, rather than people who had legal claims to them. "What's their strongest argument?" Eli had asked. "The inheritance issue," Jennifer replied honestly. "Sarah's parents left a substantial estate, life insurance policies, property investments, and business assets that will be worth nearly $500,000 when she reaches 18. The relatives can argue they're better positioned to manage those assets and ensure Sarah receives maximum benefit from her parents' financial planning." The money complicated everything, adding layers of suspicion about motivations and creating legal arguments that had nothing to do with Sarah's emotional needs or psychological welfare. Eli found himself wondering if Sarah even knew about the inheritance, or if she'd been shielded from information that painted her as a financial prize rather than a child who needed love and stability. During the court-ordered evaluation process, Sarah had been interviewed by psychologists, visited by social workers, and subjected to assessments that measured everything from her academic development to her emotional attachment patterns. The reports, when they finally arrived, painted a picture of a resilient but fragile child who desperately needed consistency and unconditional acceptance. Sarah demonstrates significant anxiety around abandonment and change, Dr. Rebecca Martinez had written in her psychological evaluation. She has formed a tentative but meaningful attachment to Mr. Stoltzfus during their limited interactions, and she expresses strong preference for remaining in a rural environment that feels safe and predictable to her. But the same report noted Sarah's educational delays and suggested she might benefit from specialized tutoring and therapeutic services that were more readily available in urban areas. The California relatives seized on these recommendations, arguing that their resources and location made them better suited to address Sarah's developmental needs. The community meeting held 2 weeks before the custody hearing revealed the depth of division within their district. Families gathered in the Yoder barn on a cold December evening, their faces illuminated by kerosene lamps and their voices carrying the weight of deeply held convictions about faith, community, and individual responsibility. Bishop Samuel spoke. First, his words measured and thoughtful as he outlined concerns about their community's relationship with English legal systems. When we involve ourselves in their courts, using their lawyers to fight their battles, we risk compromising the separation that has protected our way of life for generations. Aaron Miller supported Samuel's position, arguing that Eli's individual choice could create precedent for other community members who might want to challenge established boundaries between their world and English society. What happens when the next family wants to adopt English children? What happens when social services decides our community isn't suitable for raising any children, including our own? But other voices rose in support of Eli's decision. John Bontrager, whose own family had struggled with infertility, spoke about the Christian obligation to care for orphaned children regardless of their background. This isn't about compromising our community. It's about living our faith in ways that matter to God and to a child who needs our love. Young Thomas Miller surprised everyone by speaking in favor of Eli's choice, despite his father's opposition. Maybe our community needs to show the English world that our values include compassion for children who have nowhere else to go. Maybe this is how we demonstrate that our faith produces action, not just separation. The meeting continued past midnight, with voices rising and falling in passionate but respectful debate about principles that had no easy resolution. Some families left early, uncomfortable with the level of community division over an individual family's decision. Others stayed until the last lamp was extinguished, wrestling with questions that challenged assumptions they'd held for decades. In the end, no consensus emerged beyond agreement that Eli should follow his conscience, while the community prayed for wisdom and unity, regardless of the court's decision. It was less resolution than acknowledgement that some issues were too complex for simple answers or universal agreement. The week before the custody hearing brought a surprise visit from David, Eli's brother, who arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning carrying a suitcase and wearing the expression of someone prepared for difficult conversations. 20 years had changed him. Grey hair, lines around his eyes, clothes that marked him as thoroughly English. But his voice carried the same mixture of affection and concern that had characterized their relationship since childhood. "Rebecca sends her love," David said, settling into Martha's chair with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd spent countless hours in this kitchen during their youth. "She wanted to come testify on your behalf, but her teaching schedule wouldn't permit it. She did write a letter for the judge, if that helps." They talked through the morning and afternoon, with David sharing insights from his experience navigating both Amish and English communities, his perspective on the legal system, and his understanding of children's needs based on raising Rebecca in circumstances that bridged both worlds. "You're doing the right thing," David said finally. "Sarah needs someone who will fight for her, not someone who sees her as a financial opportunity or a burden to be managed. That's worth whatever complications it creates with community boundaries." "Samuel thinks I'm compromising principles that have protected us for generations," Eli replied. "Samuel thinks tradition is more important than individual compassion," David answered. "Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. The wisdom lies in knowing which situation requires which response." That evening they sat in the living room where they'd played as children, reading Martha's journal entries aloud and marveling at her hidden dreams and prophetic insights about Eli's future parenthood. David listened with the attention of someone who'd learned to value perspectives he might have dismissed in his youth. "She knew," he said quietly. "Somehow she knew that you were meant to be a father, just not in the way either of you expected." This night before the custody hearing, Eli found himself unable to sleep, walking through his house and thinking about all the preparations that might be unnecessary if the judge ruled against him. Sarah's room stood ready, the child's quilt folded on her bed, books and toys arranged on shelves that might never be used by the child they were intended for. He thought about Martha's journal, her belief that God was preparing him for unexpected, a parenthood, her dreams of a little girl who would stand in their kitchen and help make bread. He thought about Sarah's careful questions about horses and farms, her protective clutching of the tattered teddy bear, her expression when she'd asked if she would see him again. Outside, December wind moved through bare trees with the sound of winter deepening, and somewhere in the darkness, a child was spending what might be her last night in Pennsylvania, unaware that tomorrow adults would argue about her future in a courtroom that would determine whether love or law would shape the rest of her childhood. Martha's wedding ring, which Eli had carried in his pocket every day since her death, felt heavier than usual as he prepared for the morning that would either fulfill her hidden dreams or confirm that some prayers were answered with silence, rather than the miracles that faithful hearts dared to hope for. Martha's wedding ring rested in Eli's coat pocket as he entered the Lancaster County Family Courthouse on a grey December morning, its familiar weight providing comfort in a world that suddenly felt foreign and overwhelming. The building's modern architecture and fluorescent lighting created an atmosphere that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome, with polished floors that echoed footsteps and official portraits that stared down at proceedings with bureaucratic indifference. Sarah's California relatives had arrived the night before, and Eli caught his first glimpse of them across the crowded hallway outside the courtroom. They looked exactly as he'd imagined, well-dressed, professionally groomed, carrying themselves with the confident air of people accustomed to getting what they wanted through persistence and superior resources. Michael Brennan was in his early 40s, tall and lean with the kind of casual elegance that suggested expensive clothing chosen to look effortless. His wife, Jennifer, appeared younger and more nervous, her designer outfit and perfect makeup unable to hide an underlying anxiety about the proceedings they'd initiated. Their attorney, Catherine Maxwell, commanded attention through sheer presence, a woman in her 50s who moved through the courthouse corridors with the purposeful stride of someone who knew where every office was located and which clerk could expedite any request. Her reputation preceded her, 20 years specializing in custody disputes, a track record of winning cases through thorough preparation and aggressive advocacy for her clients' interests. Eli's own attorney, Jennifer Walsh, looked modest by comparison. Her off-the-rack suit and sensible shoes marked her as someone who worked with ordinary families rather than entertainment industry clients, but her calm confidence suggested competence that didn't require expensive display. "Remember," Jennifer Walsh whispered as they took their seats at the plaintiff's table, "this isn't about who can provide more material advantages. It's about who can provide better emotional stability and genuine love. Stay focused on Sarah's needs, not your own desires or their accusations." Judge Margaret Chen entered the courtroom with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd heard countless custody disputes and understood that legal decisions carried emotional consequences that extended far beyond whatever appeared in official records. At 58, she'd gained a reputation for thorough attention to evidence and skepticism about claims that prioritized legal technicalities over children's welfare. This is a custody hearing to determine the best placement for Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, age 8, currently in foster care, Judge Chen announced. "I've reviewed all submitted documents, psychological evaluations, and character references. Today we'll hear arguments from all parties and, if appropriate, testimony from the child herself." Catherine Maxwell rose first, her opening statement delivered with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to winning through superior presentation. "Your Honor, this case involves fundamental questions about cultural appropriateness, educational opportunities, and financial stewardship that extend beyond simple emotional attachment." She gestured toward photographs of the California relative's home, a spacious house in an upscale Los Angeles neighborhood, complete with swimming pool, home office, and bedrooms that looked like magazine advertisements for contemporary living. "My clients offer Sarah advantages that simply cannot be replicated in rural Pennsylvania," Maxwell continued. "Access to specialized educational programs, psychological counseling services, cultural opportunities, and proper management of the substantial inheritance her parents intended for her benefit." The attack on Amish community life came next, delivered with diplomatic language that nonetheless painted their lifestyle as inadequate for raising a modern child. Limited educational opportunities, isolation from contemporary society, lack of access to mental health services, and religious practices that might conflict with Sarah's need to process trauma through professional counseling. Sarah's parents were college-educated professionals who valued academic achievement and cultural exposure, Maxwell argued. They established trust funds and educational savings accounts specifically to ensure their daughter would have access to the best possible opportunities. Can the Amish community provide college preparation? Can they manage complex financial instruments? Can they ensure Sarah receives trauma counseling that meets contemporary professional standards? Each question landed like a calculated blow, highlighting gaps between what Eli could offer and what modern child-rearing theory suggested Sarah needed. The inheritance issue provided particular ammunition, nearly $500,000 that required sophisticated financial management and long-term planning that extended beyond the capabilities of someone whose community avoided involvement with investment markets and complex legal structures. Blood relatives have natural priority in custody decisions, Maxwell concluded, but in this case they also offer practical advantages that serve Sarah's long-term interests in ways that good intentions simply cannot match. When she sat down, the courtroom felt heavy with implications that extended beyond Sarah's specific situation to questions about whether traditional communities could adequately serve children who came from different backgrounds with different needs. Jennifer Walsh's response began quietly, without dramatic gestures or PowerPoint presentations, focusing instead on the human elements that legal arguments sometimes overlooked. "Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about love," she said, simply. "Not financial management, not educational theory, not cultural compatibility, just the basic human need for unconditional acceptance and emotional security." She introduced evidence that painted a different picture of the California relatives' motivations. Financial records showing they'd made no attempt to contact Sarah during the 8 months she'd been in foster care. Phone logs indicating their first inquiry came 3 days after learning about her inheritance. Employment records suggesting their entertainment industry careers involved significant travel and irregular schedules that might not provide the stability a traumatized child required. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan hired an attorney before they hired a child psychologist, Walsh observed. They researched inheritance laws before they researched Sarah's emotional needs. They prepared legal arguments before they prepared a bedroom in their home. Character witnesses for Eli began testifying, painting a picture of a man whose capacity for nurturing had been proven through decades of caring for animals, supporting neighbors, and maintaining the kind of stable household routine that provided security rather than excitement. Mrs. Patterson took the stand to describe Eli's interaction with Sarah during supervised visits, his completion of parenting classes, and his demonstrated understanding of childhood trauma and appropriate responses to behavioral challenges. Mr. Stoltzfus asks questions about Sarah's emotional needs rather than her inheritance, she testified. He's concerned about her healing rather than her college prospects. He sees her as a child who needs love rather than a responsibility to be managed. Dr. Martinez, the psychologist who'd evaluated all parties, provided clinical perspective that supported emotional attachment over material advantages. Sarah demonstrates clear preference for Mr. Stoltzfus and anxiety about potential relocation to California, she testified. She's experienced multiple placement changes, and stability has become more important to her psychological welfare than access to specialized services or educational opportunities. But the most powerful moment came when Judge Chen asked if Sarah could testify on her own behalf. The courtroom fell silent as the judge explained that 8 years old was young for such testimony, but that Sarah's preferences would carry weight in the final decision if she felt able to express them clearly. Sarah entered the courtroom holding Mrs. Patterson's hand, wearing a simple blue dress that made her look even smaller than usual. Her tattered teddy bear remained in the hallway. Mrs. Patterson had explained that the courtroom was a place for grown-up conversations where toys weren't appropriate, but her eyes searched the room until they found Eli's familiar face. Judge. Jen's voice gentled as she explained the situation in terms an 8-year-old could understand. Sarah, some adults are trying to decide where you should live. I'd like to hear what you think about that, if you feel ready to share your thoughts. The answer came in a voice barely above a whisper, but every word carried clearly in the hushed courtroom. I want to live with Papa Eli on his farm, with the horses and Patches the cat. Papa Eli. The words hit him like sunlight, breaking through storm clouds, unexpected and perfect and more precious than any legal victory could ever be. Judge Chen's gavel rested in her hands like an instrument of divine judgment, its weight representing the power to determine a child's entire future with a single, decisive blow. The courtroom held its collective breath as she reviewed the final documents, her expression revealing nothing about the internal deliberation that would shape Sarah's destiny and validate or destroy the dreams that had brought them all to this moment. This case presents competing visions of what constitutes the best interests of a child, Judge Chen began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who understood that legal decisions created human consequences extending far beyond whatever appeared in official records. On one hand, we have blood relatives who can provide material advantages, educational opportunities, and financial stewardship that align with contemporary standards for child welfare. They offer access to specialized services, cultural exposure, and professional management of substantial assets that could benefit Sarah throughout her lifetime. The California relatives leaned forward in their seats, their attorney's confident expression suggesting she expected vindication for arguments that had dominated the morning's proceedings. On the other hand, we have a foster placement that offers emotional stability, genuine affection, and the kind of consistent daily care that traumatized children require for healing and healthy development. Judge Chen's gaze moved from the legal documents to Sarah, who sat beside Mrs. Patterson with the careful composure of someone who'd learned not to expect too much from adult promises. The psychological evaluations are clear. Sarah has formed a meaningful attachment to Mr. Stoltzfus and expresses strong preference for remaining in his care. Dr. Martinez's testimony indicates that another placement change could be detrimental to her emotional recovery, particularly if it involves relocation to an unfamiliar environment. Catherine Maxwell's confident expression began to shift as the judge's reasoning became apparent. More importantly, the evidence raises serious questions about the California relatives' motivations. Their sudden interest in Sarah's welfare, coinciding precisely with discovery of her inheritance, suggests priorities that may not align with her best interests. Michael Brennan's face reddened as the implications became clear, his wife's nervous, fidgeting intensifying as their carefully constructed arguments crumbled beneath judicial scrutiny. The court recognizes that Mr. Stoltzfus's rural community cannot provide certain services that might be available in urban areas, Judge Chen continued. However, the evidence indicates that Sarah's primary need is for emotional stability and unconditional love, both of which are abundantly available in his placement. Jennifer Walsh squeezed Eli's arm as the judge's reasoning reached its logical conclusion. Furthermore, the court notes that inheritance funds can be professionally managed regardless of Sarah's residential placement, eliminating the financial stewardship argument as a determining factor in custody decisions. Judge Chen lifted her gavel, its movement seeming to occur in slow motion as decades of legal precedent and months of preparation culminated in the single moment that would determine whether love or law would shape a child's future. The court hereby awards permanent custody of Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell to Eli Stoltzfus, with provisions for regular monitoring by social services and access to counseling services as needed. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed to echo through the courtroom like thunder, followed immediately by Sarah's joyful cry of "Papa Eli," as she launched herself from her chair toward the man who'd fought for the right to love her without conditions or expectations. Eli caught her in his arms, feeling the solid reality of her small body pressed against his chest, while tears he hadn't expected ran down his weathered cheeks. Over her shoulder, he saw Michael and Jennifer Brennan speaking in heated whispers with their attorney, their expressions combining disappointment with barely concealed anger at a legal system that had valued sentiment over practical considerations. "We'll appeal this decision," Catherine Maxwell announced, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "This placement is not in Sarah's long-term interests, and higher courts will recognize that blood relatives with superior resources should have priority over strangers with good intentions." But her threats felt empty in the face of Sarah's obvious joy and Judge Chen's carefully reasoned decision. The law had chosen love over legal technicality, stability over material advantage, and present emotional needs over theoretical future benefits. As they left the courtroom, Eli noticed Bishop Samuel standing near the entrance, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakable. The bishop had come to witness the outcome of a battle he'd opposed, perhaps preparing to address whatever consequences Eli's victory might create for community relationships with government authorities. But instead of confrontation, Samuel approached, with something that might have been respect mixed with resignation. "The child clearly belongs with you," he said quietly. "Perhaps God's plans don't always align with our understanding of proper boundaries between our community and theirs." It wasn't complete endorsement, but it wasn't condemnation either. A diplomatic acknowledgement that love had triumphed over legal technicalities in ways that challenged established assumptions about community separation while affirming deeper values about caring for those in need. It wasn't complete endorsement, but it wasn't condemnation either. A diplomatic acknowledgement that love had triumphed over legal technicalities in ways that challenged established assumptions about community separation while affirming deeper values about caring for those in need. Mrs. Patterson handled the immediate paperwork with efficient compassion, explaining the transition process and ongoing requirements for maintaining custody. Regular home visits, continued counseling if needed, educational assessments, and annual reviews that would monitor Sarah's adjustment and well-being. "She'll need time to fully trust that this placement is permanent," Mrs. Patterson warned. "Children who've experienced multiple moves often test boundaries to see if this situation is really different from all the others." But as they walked to Eli's buggy for the ride home, to what was now officially Sarah's permanent residence, her chatter about horses and cats and the bedroom that was really hers suggested that some trusts were already being established. "Will I go to your school?" she asked, settling beside him on the buggy seat, as if she'd been making this journey her entire life. "If you'd like to," Eli replied. "It's different from English schools, smaller, quieter, with children from our community. But Teacher Sarah is kind and patient with students who need extra help." "Two Sarahs?" she asked with the first giggle he'd heard from her. "Two Sarahs," he confirmed, feeling his own smile break free for the first time in months. "We'll have to figure out how to tell you apart." The drive home took them through countryside that looked different somehow, transformed by the knowledge that this journey marked the beginning of a new chapter, rather than another temporary arrangement. Fields that had seemed empty during months of solitary living now appeared full of potential for shared experiences. Places to walk together, projects to complete together, seasons to experience through the eyes of someone discovering rural life for the first time. As they approached his farm, Sarah pressed her face to the buggy window with excitement that made Eli's chest tight with protective tenderness. "There's my bedroom window," she announced, as if she'd been living there for years rather than hoping for it through weeks of uncertainty. "And there's Patches." Eli pointed to the barn cat, sunning herself on the porch rail. "She's been waiting to meet you properly." Sarah's joy was infectious, transforming his quiet farmhouse into something that felt like home in ways it hadn't since Martha's death. Her presence filled empty spaces with possibility, silence with potential conversation, and solitude with the kind of companionship that made even ordinary moments feel like small celebrations. The California relatives had departed without speaking to either of them, their expensive attorney leading them toward appeals that might drag on for months but could no longer threaten the fundamental reality of Sarah's placement. Legal challenges ahead might create complications, but they couldn't change the essential fact that Sarah was finally where she belonged, in the care of someone who'd fought for her not because law required it, but because love demanded it. As they carried her few possessions into the house that was now officially her home, Eli thought about Martha's hidden journal and her prophetic dreams of a little girl who would help make bread in their kitchen. The dreams had taken longer to fulfill than either of them could have imagined, arriving through paths neither of them could have predicted, but carrying the same essential truth Martha had believed, that love finds ways to express itself even when circumstances seem impossible. Judge Chen's gavel rested in her hands like an instrument of divine judgment, its weight representing the power to determine a child's entire future with a single decisive blow. The courtroom held its collective breath as she reviewed the final documents, her expression revealing nothing about the internal deliberation that would shape Sarah's destiny and validate or destroy the dreams that had brought them all to this moment. This case presents competing visions of what constitutes the best interests of a child, Judge Chen began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who understood that legal decisions created human consequences extending far beyond whatever appeared in official records. On one hand, we have blood relatives who can provide material advantages, educational opportunities, and financial stewardship that align with contemporary standards for child welfare. They offer access to specialized services, cultural exposure, and professional management of substantial assets that could benefit Sarah throughout her lifetime. The California relatives leaned forward in their seats, their attorney's confident expression suggesting she expected vindication for arguments that had dominated the morning's proceedings. On the other hand, we have a foster placement that offers emotional stability, genuine affection, and the kind of consistent daily care that traumatized children require for healing and healthy development. Judge Chen's gaze moved from the legal documents to Sarah, who sat beside Mrs. Patterson with the careful composure of someone who'd learned not to expect too much from adult promises. The psychological evaluations are clear. Sarah has formed a meaningful attachment to Mr. Stoltzfus and expresses strong preference for remaining in his care. Dr. Martinez's testimony indicates that another placement change could be detrimental to her emotional recovery, particularly if it involves relocation to an unfamiliar environment. Catherine Maxwell's confident expression began to shift as the judge's reasoning became apparent. More importantly, the evidence raises serious questions about the California relatives' motivations. Their sudden interest in Sarah's welfare, coinciding precisely with discovery of her inheritance, suggests priorities that may not align with her best interests. Michael Brennan's face reddened as the implications became clear. His wife's nervous, fidgeting intensifying as their carefully constructed arguments crumbled beneath judicial scrutiny. The court recognizes that Mr. Stoltzfus's rural community cannot provide certain services that might be available in urban areas, Judge Chen continued. However, the evidence indicates that Sarah's primary need is for emotional stability and unconditional love, both of which are abundantly available in his placement. Jennifer Walsh squeezed Eli's arm as the judge's reasoning reached its logical conclusion. Furthermore, the court notes that inheritance funds can be professionally managed regardless of Sarah's residential placement, eliminating the financial stewardship argument as a determining factor in custody decisions. Judge Chen lifted her gavel, its movement seeming to occur in slow motion as decades of legal precedent and months of preparation culminated in the single moment that would determine whether love or law would shape a child's future. The court hereby awards permanent custody of Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell to Eli Stoltzfus, with provisions for regular monitoring by social services and access to counseling services as needed. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed to echo through the courtroom like thunder, followed immediately by Sarah's joyful cry of "Papa Eli," as she launched herself from her chair toward the man who'd fought for the right to love her without conditions or expectations. Eli caught her in his arms, feeling the solid reality of her small body pressed against his chest, while tears he hadn't expected ran down his weathered cheeks. Over her shoulder, he saw Michael and Jennifer Brennan speaking in heated whispers with their attorney, their expressions combining disappointment with barely concealed anger at a legal system that had valued sentiment over practical considerations. "We'll appeal this decision," Catherine Maxwell announced loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "This placement is not in Sarah's long-term interests, and higher courts will recognize that blood relatives with superior resources should have priority over strangers with good intentions." But her threats felt empty in the face of Sarah's obvious joy and Judge Chen's carefully reasoned decision. The law had chosen love over legal technicality, stability over material advantage, and present emotional needs over theoretical future benefits. As they left the courtroom, Eli noticed Bishop Samuel standing near the entrance, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakable. The bishop had come to witness the outcome of a battle he'd opposed, perhaps preparing to address whatever consequences Eli's victory might create for community relationships with government authorities. But instead of confrontation, Samuel approached with something that might have been respect mixed with resignation. "The child clearly belongs with you," he said quietly. "Perhaps God's plans don't always align with our understanding of proper boundaries between our community and theirs." It wasn't complete endorsement, but it wasn't condemnation either, a diplomatic acknowledgement that love had triumphed over legal technicalities in ways that challenged established assumptions about community separation while affirming deeper values about caring for those in need. Mrs. Patterson handled the immediate paperwork with efficient compassion, explaining the transition process and ongoing requirements for maintaining custody. Regular home visits, continued counseling if needed, educational assessments, and annual reviews that would monitor Sarah's adjustment and well-being. "She'll need time to fully trust that this placement is permanent," Mrs. Patterson warned. "Children who've experienced multiple moves often test boundaries to see if this situation is really different from all the others." "She'll need time to fully trust that this placement is permanent," Mrs. Patterson warned. "Children who've experienced multiple moves often test boundaries to see if this situation is really different from all the others." But as they walked to Eli's buggy for the ride home to what was now officially Sarah's permanent residence, her chatter about horses and cats and the bedroom that was really hers suggested that some trusts were already being established. "Will I go to your school?" she asked, settling beside him on the buggy seat, as if she'd been making this journey her entire life. "If you'd like to," Eli replied. "It's different from English schools. Smaller, quieter, with children from our community. But Teacher Sarah is kind and patient with students who need extra help." "Two Sarahs?" she asked with the first giggle he'd heard from her. "Two Sarahs," he confirmed, feeling his own smile break free for the first time in months. "We'll have to figure out how to tell you apart." The drive home took them through countryside that looked different somehow, transformed by the knowledge that this journey marked the beginning of a new chapter rather than another temporary arrangement. Fields that had seemed empty during months of solitary living now appeared full of potential for shared experiences, places to walk together, projects to complete together, seasons to experience through the eyes of someone discovering rural life for the first time. As they approached his farm, Sarah pressed her face to the buggy window with excitement that made Eli's chest tight with protective tenderness. "There's my bedroom window," she announced, as if she'd been living there for years rather than hoping for it through weeks of uncertainty. "And there's Patches." Eli pointed to the barn cat sunning herself on the porch rail. "She's been waiting to meet you properly." Sarah's joy was infectious, transforming his quiet farmhouse into something that felt like home in ways it hadn't since Martha's death. Her presence filled empty spaces with possibility, silence with potential conversation, and solitude with the kind of companionship that made even ordinary moments feel like small celebrations. The California relatives had departed without speaking. To either of them, their expensive attorney leading them toward appeals that might drag on for months, but could no longer threaten the fundamental reality of Sarah's placement. Legal challenges ahead might create complications, but they couldn't change the essential fact that Sarah was finally where she belonged, in the care of someone who'd fought for her, not because law required it, but because love demanded it. They carried her few possessions into the house that was now officially her home. Eli thought about Martha's hidden journal and her prophetic dreams of a little girl who would help make bread in their kitchen. The dreams had taken longer to fulfill than either of them could have imagined, arriving through paths neither of them could have predicted, but carrying the same essential truth Martha had believed: that love finds ways to express itself even when circumstances seem impossible.